what might you be hoping to learn from our time together? And I'll ask one of my colleagues to kindly read those because I don't have up my second screen yet.
And if it's easier for you to just unmute and share, that's also an option.
Okay. Do we have any other chat? Because I can't see the chat.
No, we don't, not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Amparo, do you mind kind of sharing your idea behind this and like what inspired you to reimagine Latinx Heritage Month?
Cindy just put me on the spot. Okay. Sorry. I am Amparo Chavez Gonzalez, and I am a first-generation immigrant to the United States. And the impetus for this came very much from my experiences as a teacher coach in many, many classrooms where I love that I see a lot of people sharing the stories of really important Latinos from Latin America. And I love that. What inspired me was to think about what might this look like if we think about the incredible contributions of the Latinx community in the United States and centering that as part of Latinx Heritage Month, right? And what that means for young people to see themselves, their community, and to think about their future as part of this month. So that was a big impetus for me, and I'll share a little bit more later of what I see when I work with students in the classroom.
So thank you so much. I think we can move on to the next slide, introduction.
Okay. All right, so we're going to introduce ourselves. I'll start since I already opened, since you put me on the spot. I identify as a Chicana. My family came from Mexico, and I was the sort of the end of the first wave, second wave of Mexican Americans, Latinos attending college. And so for me, this term Chicana has a connection to that, has a connection to people throughout the world and third world liberation situations, joining with one another and fighting for each other's civil rights. Depending on where I am, I call myself Chicana, Latina, Mexican, Mexican American, Chilanga, all sorts of different names based on the community that I'm with. Okay, who's next?
Thank you, Amparo. That would be me. My name is Danny Diaz, and I am the director of the UCLA History Geography Project. So I am a fourth generation Mexican. That's how I identify. It's always been Mexican. It used to be Mexican American. I just decided I'm Mexican as of a few years ago. My experience is pretty different from, but also similar from the experiences of like my colleagues here and many Latinx folks that I meet in day to day. My great-grandparents immigrated here in the early 1900s, others during the Mexican Revolution as well. And so our experiences is what it means to be Mexican have been shaped through going through schooling and working in the United States for 100 years. So I'm glad to be with you all. I'm going to pass the mic over to Mark Anthony.
Thank you, Daniel. My name is Mark Anthony, and I'm the program coordinator for the History Project. And I identify with the term Latino. And I think this term in particular for me was something that was always encompassing and just very overarching. And I felt like that was kind of my experience growing up. I feel like I happened to grow up in a community that was predominantly Mexican, but I found like my friendships to be with a lot of Central Americans, Puerto Ricans, and I felt like my interest was always being in communion with them. So I felt like Latino was always what felt right to me. So I think that's where I stuck with, and I feel like that's where, it just aligns with my own experiences. So I would pass the mic next to our Associate Director, Cindy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cindy Mata. And when thinking of how I self-identify, I always say I'm a Guanaca, which is a colloquial term for Salvadorian. And I was born in El Salvador. I came when I was really young. So I've lived here most of my life, but I still have really strong ties to El Salvador. I don't identify as Salvadorian American. I think I'll go as far as saying Salvi when people don't know what Guanaca means. And yeah, I think, I'm, just like, I think one of the reasons why we're all here, right, is like, what do we call ourselves? And so I think this was a really good exercise for us as we were doing our intro slides, like, well, how do we self-identify? So thank you all for coming. And I know Daniel has a little plug to make.
Yeah, I just want to let you all know that, collectively we're the UCLA History Geography Project. We're located at UCLA in the School of Education and Information Studies. We're no longer the graduate school, so I'm still trying to get comfortable with that. We're at CenterX, and CenterX is the home to various subject matter projects, the math project, science project. I really encourage all of you to look up our website. We'll drop a link in the chat in a moment to our website and to the CenterX website as well. This particular workshop in the subsequent series is part of the ESSER funding that the state of California has given to both school districts and organizations like ours that provide professional development for teachers like you. So I just wanted to make you all aware of that. You'll notice that in the slides on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice that there's a logo that says Subject California Subject Matter, and there's some really small text there. And that text is just kind of reiterating what I just said, is that this is a workshop that is funded by ESSER funds under the learning loss and sort of supporting students post-pandemic umbrella.
Perfect. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Pierre in the chat said, I hope I got that name right, that they're looking for more thoughtful, authentic ways to share Latinx contributions and celebrations with my district. So that's the answer to the beginning.
Thank you, Pierre. So sorry, I'm starting to get a sore throat. We want to acknowledge that part of why Latinx Heritage Month begins September 15th is because we celebrate the independence of several nations. El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica were free from Spain in 1821 and became the Federal Republic of Central America. Mexico, my homeland, celebrates its independence today. And on September 18th, Chile celebrates its independence from Spain, and they attained independence in 1810. I'm not quite sure, but they might have been one of the first ones. So this is why we begin September 15th, not the beginning of the month. All right. And as a land-grant institution, the UCLA History Geography Project acknowledges the Tongva Gabrielino people, who we consider the traditional caretakers of the unceded land originally known as Tabangar. For myself, my ancestral lands are the lands of the Huichol and the Mexica. And I hope that I may be a caretaker of the land, and I humbly acknowledge that I'm a settler on the land of the Tonga. Okay, Daniel. Did we lose Daniel? Sometimes his internet
He's
is not
muted.
great.
No, I've been presenting. I'm just muted. I'm sorry, everyone. Which is good because I was stumbling over my words. What I was saying is that we wanted to just quickly contextualize this day as the sort of beginning of a 31-day celebration of Latinx heritage by giving you the story behind the origins of this month. And it originally started off as a week. So no surprise, if you understand this sort of US history, modern US history, you sort of recognize that 1968 was a pretty monumental year in the country's history. It was kind of the intersection of the civil rights movement reaching a sort of a boiling point of frustration with assassinations and movements going on for 10 years plus. And the sort of like the passing of various pieces of legislation like the Voting Rights Act and the act that desegregated bus lines and schools and things like that. So 1968 is a really important year, and it's within this context that a representative from California, a guy named George Brown, who represented East LA and parts of the San Gabriel Valley, recommended this celebration of Hispanic heritage, as he called it. So this hit the desk of then President Lyndon Johnson, and it was signed into law. And I have a sort of screenshot there of the text of the law, and it was called National Hispanic Heritage Week. It was a way to celebrate the growing Hispanic, quote unquote, population of the time. And if we fast forward to 1987, Representative Esteban Torres from California recommended that it be expanded to a full month. And that was accepted and signed into law in 1988 by then President Ronald Reagan. And some of you might know that there's a sort of contentious relationship that some Mexicans have with Ronald Reagan. For various reasons. This might be one of them, but the other one is like sort of amnesty and things like that. Sort of scene where he was relatively popular back in the late 80s and 90s with a lot of Mexicans at the time. So there's way more detail to this history, and I'm encouraging you to check out this link that I'm about to put in the chat for you all. And as you kick this month off with your students, it's always a good idea to give them the context of why we have this month. Right? Okay, so if anyone has any questions or any feedback, or maybe you have some information about the history behind this month, please put it in the chat. And if we don't have any questions or comments at the time, I'm going to go ahead, move us along, and pass this over to Cindy.
Perfect, thank you. I see a comment in the chat about can we make the slideshow available? And I believe we will be able to make the slideshow available after the presentation. So yes. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? And I'm not sure how you want to do. Do you still want to do breakout rooms?
I think we can leave it up to participants. I think we're a small enough group that we don't really need them.
Yeah, at least for this part, I feel like it would be hard to do in breakout rooms.
It might be really nice if we could ask you to introduce yourself, please. Tell us what grade level you teach and what school. So that way folks get to know one another. Sorry, we we didn't do a good job of being in community today. So my mother would be like, presenta la gente. So please introduce yourselves to one another.
I'll go ahead. I have the stop sign right now. My name is Pierre Larson. I'm in Texas, and I'm over social studies for the district. So I'm really looking forward to the things I'll be learning and listening this day. Thanks.
Thank
I can
you.
go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. I'm a high school history teacher, and I'm really excited to be here. I have a lot of thoughts in regards to even just the naming of Hispanic Heritage Month. And I'm excited to be in conversation with y'all.
Okay, I think some folks are going to put it in the chat. Appreciate it, Callie and Pierre. All right.
What's up, everybody? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Ron Espiritu. I currently am a program coordinator of a K through 12 ethnic studies program in Camino Nuevo. I'm driving right now, but happy to be listening to the conversation. And my identity is always a teacher. This is first year in 15 that I'm out of the classroom, but enjoying that role too.
Thank you, Ron. All
Awesome.
right, go ahead, Cindy.
So I think if we can move to the next slide, since we won't be needing that, the breakout rooms. I'm gonna drop in a link, and sorry for the folks who are driving. Please don't Jamboard and drive. But for the rest of us, there's a Jamboard that has this question. If you could click on the link, and the question, we're just trying to get a feel for what are key ideas, events, people that you teach during Latinx Heritage Month. So just dropped. Right, I just dropped that link in. You could just take a moment. We'll give it like a minute. And thank you, Amparo. And then as folks start to populate, we'll get some answers in here from you all. Also, we definitely know some folks, maybe typing is not available right now. So if you wanted to unmute and just share maybe some of the key ideas, events, or people that you highlight during this month, that would be cool too. So we definitely want to be accommodating.
Well, I know that one of the things that I saw a lot when I was in the classroom was a sort of Cesar Chavez kind of, like he just kind of represented the UFW and Chavez, and I'm not saying that that is not important. It definitely is important, but it seemed to kind of be a sort of like, let's set aside a day to celebrate Chavez in the UFW. And I don't know if anybody else has similar experiences, but in the schools that I taught in, that seemed to be it.
I can piggyback off of that. I don't know if you can hear me, sorry.
Yes, yes.
I teach second graders, and usually we expose them through read alouds. And yes, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. But even when I bring up Cesar Chavez, we are in a one-way immersion Spanish dual program. And we talk about how he was opposed to bilingual programs, right? And we talk about how people are not perfect. So there is this, how do you say, like multiple perspectives, even if it is, you know, we don't put them on pedestals. We do talk about like we're human. And yeah, I totally agree. It shouldn't just be him for the whole month.
Thank you for that. If you all want to keep on sharing, I'm gonna try and capture some of that stuff on the Padlet. But if I'm gonna put my piece up there too and keep it a full buck, my experience, I see somebody joining us right now. My experience is that Hispanic Heritage Month, Latinx Heritage Month, kind of gets hijacked by Mexican and Mexican American history. For the most part, as I've experienced it as a student, and then also when I was in the classroom, there's like a heavy emphasis on Mexican and Mexican American contributions, and not a lot of Central American folks or you know, the Latinos in the Caribbean. So yeah, definitely. Thank you.
And I would add that if you live on the East Coast, it becomes Puerto Rican focused, right? So depending on where you live in the country, I'm sure that in Florida, it's very Cuban focused, right? We forget to think about that term across the country. And so part of our conversations today are, how do we think about the fact that Latinos live in every single state of the nation, and that we are not a monolithic community, right? Some of us have been here since the 1500s, and some of us are trying still to come in. And so that's a really important part of the conversation. Anyone else who would like to share?
I also think, like, you
Yeah, I
know,
wanted.
oh, go ahead, Ron. Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to briefly share. Thanks, Daniel. So I just wanted to share, like, I identify as Chicano. You know, I'm similar to Daniel's family history, third generation Mexican American. My family came across differences, roots in it. But thinking about, like, I've been teaching in the ethnic studies program that I lead is in MacArthur Park, Westlake, Pico Union. And so the students that I teach are predominantly Mexican and Central American. And we have a large population from Alaska and different parts of Mexico. And we also have Afro-Latino students, including like Garifuna students from Honduras. And so, you know, thinking about, like, I appreciate this conversation because that's a big part of the work that we're trying to do in the network that I work for, as well as, like, being inclusive of Central American students, Indigenous students, Afro-Latino students, and also like making sure that we recognize and celebrate like the diversity within the Latinx community, including LGBTQ students, and affirming their identities part of this month as well. That's not to say I have it all figured out. Increasingly, I also see like our ethnicities similar to my own children. And I'm also part Filipino, right? So I got like my children are like Filipino, Mexican, Salvadoran. You know, it's like there's like these complex identities that I think we have opportunities to explore as we think about reimagining this month.
Thank you. I think that's a great transition. Thank you, Ron.
We have one more. Maria Ruiz was hoping to share.
Yes, please, Maria.
She was having some,
Mm-mm.
no, she's been having some audio issues, I know.
Okay, well, should spirit move you, the chat is open. All right.
Just Maria.
And if we can move to the next slide. And I think that was the point of like populating that Jamboard, right? Was to start to like just look and like have a discussion with like what narratives do we tell about the Latinx community in the US? Does the narrative reflect a particular community? And does what you teach reflect the heritage of your students? So just keeping that in mind. Okay, perfect. And there was one more piece on the Jamboard, so I definitely want to acknowledge that facilitate a discussion around Latinx stereotypes and give students a chance to write about someone in their personal life that represents something positive about Latinx people and culture. Yes, and I thank you for bringing that up, because I think too, like one thing I know in our planning sessions we've talked about is like, we definitely don't spend enough time highlighting our communities, right? And the people within our communities. Like we definitely highlight like the superstars, but like you said here, right? Of like, who are the people that live amongst us that are doing great things for our community, and like keeping it to the personal lives of students and communities. Thank you.
Okay. Ready? So I want to have a conversation. We've been talking about our own self-identification and some of our students, and embedded in what Kelly brought up is who are we and what do we look like? And also, how are we identified within and outside of our ancestral countries of origin, right? For many of us who have grown up in the US and we go back to the homelands of our ancestors, or for me, for example, my birthplace, it's very obvious that my worldview is very much has been impacted by living in the United States. And so oftentimes it's difficult for me to figure out what to call myself or who I am. And the same thing happens when I come back to the US, right? As well as, for example, I lived in New York City for a long time. And my students were Puerto Rican and Dominican and Cuban. And so it was a way different way of thinking about my Latinidad and how I identified, and it expanded the way I thought about that. However, there's a big difference between the way that we think of ourselves within and without the community and how the US government identifies and classifies us. And so I want to offer you this picture. 23 of the 46 founders of Los Angeles, if we ignore the Tamba for a little bit, would be the ancestors of what those Latinos would look like today. So if you look at this image, you notice that more than half of them are Afro-Latinos, right? There are only 2 Spaniards in the group of the 46 who were sent from Spain at that time, or what later on became Mexico, to Alta California. There were only 2 Spaniards. The rest of them were mestizos, mulattos in the group, and a big number of them were children. And so you start to see this notion of what Latinos or Latinx community looks like starts to shift, right? Including in Los Angeles. That, for example, the Latinx community in LA has always been diverse, has always been multilingual, has always been a one where interactions with other cultures and other communities was very much a part of that reality. Questions, comments? Okay. So I'm going to share some demographics with you. In the United States, there are 62.1 million Latinx community members. I'm reading these out loud for the folks who are not able to, oops. Sorry about that. Yeah, won't let me go back. Oh, so a really important statistic that I found is that only 33% of the Latinx community in the US is foreign born. And that's really important for the way we think about teaching Latinx Heritage Month. 4 out of 5 of us are US citizens. And increasingly, when we're able to identify that we are multiracial, we are. So 1 in 5 Latinos considers themselves multiracial. And then if you look at this graphic, it tells you about our median income from 2019 to 2020. Oops, maybe I need to go back to that one, huh? See if it'll bring it back. And so you start to see that our median income not only fell during the pandemic, but it's way below the average. You guys will get these stats, sorry. And then we are 18.4 of the United States population at this point, which means we are the largest ethnic group. I want to be clear that we understand that the ethnic group does not mean racially, right? And that's a really hard concept for kids because we already talked about how many of us are Afro-Latinos, how many of us consider ourselves Asian Latinos, how many of us have parents, 1 or 2, who are Caucasian, and then tons of us who racially are considered white in the United States when it comes to census. And so that's those are important distinctions. Okay. And then in LA and California, you see that Latinos are 39% of California's population. We are in fact the largest ethnic group at the moment, and we are only going to increase. This is from 2019. However, our unemployment is right up there with our African-American compatriots. It's very high. In LA, we are projected to be more than half of the population, and currently right now we're almost half. 61% of K-12 students in LA are Latinx. 62% of them have a high school degree, and only 13% of them over the age of 25 have a BA or more. 14% of the Latinx community in LA are uninsured, and 18% live in poverty. And so during this notion of COVID, you start to see the importance of that 14% being uninsured and the numbers in poverty. Then I wanted to show you 2 more things. All right. The internet, and this is a time where our internet in Whittier gets funky. Let's see if I can do it this way. There we go. All right, so what you see, that graph you see on the bottom, for those of you who are driving and can't see, are the median incomes in California. all of these, when you go to their links, will show up and tell you the racial identity of the community. So the dark blue is Caucasian, the light blue, the 96,000 one is Asians, right? And then Latinos are the 55,362. However, in that chart, we're not identified as Hispanic or Latinx, we're classified as other, because in terms of racial identity, we're mixed in with the African American stats, we're mixed in with the Caucasian stats, and then somehow at times we're extrapolated. And this is part of that idea of how does the United States identify us from the outside in, and the complexity of that. I'm going to show you real quick. This chart tells you population estimates of California. And what I would love for you guys to take a look at is this part, which gets really confusing. If you look at white only, the percent in California is 71.9. You go all the way down, Hispanic or Latino percent is 39.4. White alone, not Hispanic or Latino percent, is 36.5. So in many instances, we are being counted with our Caucasian neighbors. And if there is not enough statistical folks looking at it to separate that, then we get clumped in there, right? And so the needs of our community at many times are not accurately depicted because of the way that we are classified within state, city, local, and the federal government's identities for us. Okay, any thoughts? Any comments? Questions?
I just know that like one thing that came up for me when I was looking at these stats, and it kind of goes back to what Ron was saying earlier, is like the idea of like government identification versus self-identification. So I definitely understand that Latinos are the largest population in terms of the numbers. But what came up for me was thinking about the indigenous folks that are coming in from Latin America. So like indigenous, like the Zapotecs in Mexico, but also like indigenous Mayans in Guatemala, and how they're getting labeled Latino, which is like helping these stats, but they would not self-identify as Latino, right? So they self-identify as Zapotec or Mayan or Mum or all these different. So it made me think of like that duality of like, how do you self-identify versus how are you getting classified for purposes of counting?
Yeah, absolutely. And also how many different times you're being counted, right? So that if you are, especially in LAUSD or in our communities, if you are a non-English speaking, is the assumption that because you came from Mexico, that your first language, or Guatemala, that your first language is Spanish. And it may not be. That might be your second or third language if you're one of the members of the indigenous communities from coming to the US right now, right? And so it's really important to think about how do we open up that conversation within ourselves, but also with our students about what this means, right? And what it means in terms of services for them as well. Thank you, Cindy. And so during the pandemic, I really wanted to share these stats, right? That are really, really important. And we know that there's a historic reason why the Latinx community, the African American community are not getting vaccinated. At the same time, you see these low numbers in terms of vaccination. And then at the same time, you see the high numbers of the percentage of deaths. So if Latinos are the largest population within, for example, California, yet in California, they also attribute 47.1 of the deaths in California, you start to see the disparities, right? And the importance of the community having access to, information and support, but also the kinds of services that will help the community, the many different communities deal with not having health insurance, not being able to access services, not being able to have unemployment or get unemployment. There's all these layers of multiple layers of issues that happen. Oh, we lost Kelly for a minute there. And I apologize to Pierre. I know we don't have stats for Texas, except Texas is in the graphic. That's a one time. I have some Texas stuff. However, in some of the other materials, you'll see Texas. Okay, Daniel, I'm going to pass it on to Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Amparo. So whether you are a Latinx or not, I think this part of the presentation today, we felt was important. So we see that there's various terms, and if you are Latinx, then you probably have a preference or even maybe even a strong opinion on some of these terms. And if you're not, you might be wondering, how do I address my students, right? How do I, as a group, right? How am I supposed to address them? And we wanted to spend a few minutes here talking through this and helping you think about, if you are Latinx, how you would prefer to be identified. If you are Latinx, how you would like to be identified as a group. And then how we can help our students think about identity and work through some of these questions, and think about the roots of some of these terms, like Hispanic, right? Hispanic is a pretty, I would say, is one of the more polarizing terms. And it's me personally, I don't want to be identified as a Hispanic, but I know folks who don't mind being identified as a Hispanic. And you'll see right now we have a video that we're about to play for you. I can do this one of two ways. We're a smaller group than we expected, so we can play it for you on the video. Amps, I don't know if you have the setup for that, and if you don't, I can just drop the link to it in the chat, and you all can just mute yourself and press play.
I'm gonna stop sharing and then I'll play the video. How about that? Let me come back in.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. And then I'll share again.
Okay, and the video that we're about to share is also in the chat. So if you want to bookmark that.
All right, here we go.
I identify as a Hispanic American.
Afro-Latina.
Mexican American. Chicana. Mexican.
Afro-Latino.
To my family, I am Puerto Rican. To the country, I am Latina.
Growing up, I felt as though I was too Black to be Latina and too Latina to be Black.
Chicana, I think, identifies more of the political and social values that I hold more than just where my family's from.
I don't feel pressure to be more Latino or American. I'm comfortable with who I am, like, culturally.
How can I be Mexican when I'm pressured to be more American? How can I be American when I'm pressured to be more Mexican?
My family, growing up, wanted me to, stick with my Hispanic roots, but also did not want me to show those roots to the world.
A lot of the times people didn't even know that I was Cuban because I guess I don't look like your typical Cuban.
My mom is Mexican, so I've always grown up with her culture, with her language, while being American doesn't come up as easily.
I've gotten people assume, even other Latinos assume that I'm white or that I'm not Latina or Chicana. It definitely hurts, but at the same time, it's not something that I can control. I think I can do my best to project that identity.
It's hilarious when you walk into a room and they don't think you're Caucasian enough, you're not American enough, you're not Latino enough.
Being Latino isn't as accepted as it should be.
It makes me feel pressured to fit a certain mold here in the United States. But now that I'm older, it's more like, it's what I make of it.
That doesn't stop me from being proud of who I am.
And then ultimately, I think what you settle on is how you view yourself.
We're kind of stripped in a lot of cases of our Spanish tongue and our Spanish heritage and told it's really important that you only speak English.
Because if you're from a Spanish-speaking country and you can't speak Spanish, it's harder for you to connect with the people there.
And not being ashamed when you do speak Spanish, but also not being ashamed if you weren't taught it.
Okay, so Spanish is not my first language because my parents were afraid of me being discriminated against because they were discriminated against. And now they're hurting me because I'm not Latino enough because my first language, but they don't know that I couldn't speak Spanish because my parents were afraid of me getting hurt.
My parents have already done all the work for me, and that's why I feel like I have like a bright future ahead of me because the work's already been done. All I have to do is like harvest what has been put on the ground.
But it's about me and other Afro-Latinos working really hard and continuing to make strides.
I feel like this country has a lot of opportunity.
When you have pushed another human being towards the light, towards positivity, towards a voting booth, towards using their power, you are powerful.
People are telling us as Hispanics that we don't belong here. That's kind of motivated us to join together as a Hispanic community and say, we do belong here. And despite what you're saying, I will prove to you why I do belong here.
Thank you, Amparo. I hope you're all able to hear that fine, and welcome to those of you who just signed on. We're having a conversation right now about identification, and we're kind of sitting with some of the terms that have been used historically to identify Latinx folks, so like the term Hispanic, and how we self-identify and how we're identified as a group. So this video was helpful because we heard different experiences. And so I know that Cindy, you're gonna make a really important point, and I see you about to talk. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop a link as you're talking in the chat.
Perfect. Yeah, and for the previous slide, right, had all these different terms around Daniel, right? Specifically like things like Latinx, Latine, Latino, and like the video went over other terminology. And so one thing that we definitely wanted to put out there for us to think of is coming from culturally responsive teaching in the brain. So this is a really good resource that I've definitely been getting into. And one of the things that the author Soretta Hammond asks us to think about is like widening our cultural aperture. So when you think of like aperture in like photography, right? The more you widen it, the more of the image that you can get. And so when thinking about identity, that's definitely something that comes up. In fact, it's in her section about culture and the different levels or types of culture. But we're offering that up, this idea of using this month as a way to learn about all these different terms and the ways people self-identify, and as a way to challenge us to widen our cultural aperture, right? Because I know from being in conversations, there are certain words that come up, like when folks say Latinx, and that might come up against people's cultural upbringings, or even this newer term in the US, Latine, which is coming from Latin American countries and their idea of a gender neutral term, right? So people's ideas around language and can language change? So we just want to offer that up as this idea of what the author really asks us to do is like, as you're here taking in these new terms, like really sit with what's coming up for you. Is this bringing up, is this expanding your notion? Is this rubbing up against your notions of what does it mean to be Latino? And instead of like placing a judgment, it's more of like doing like some self-investigative work. Like why is that bringing up something for you? What is it about the things that you've learned? Because I think that's also really important to discuss with students as we're learning about these terms, right? Is like, these are new terms and they might not align with terminology that you grew up with. That doesn't mean that they're good or bad. That just means they just are different than terms that you've been exposed to in the past. So I think that that's just important to keep in mind because it is very fluid.
Yeah, and you know, Cindy, I was hearing you talk, and I think that's a really interesting, really good question. So I put it in the chat, and you all can feel free to unmute. We're a small enough group where we can unmute and kind of have a conversation, because we were going to do this in breakout rooms. But feel free to unmute if you want to talk a little bit about this, and you can talk about some of these terms if you want. We heard some of the folks in that video talk about some of the identity issues that they have, right? The one that sort of like resonated with me was the sort of language issue that's always been a big thing for me. And I sort of now recognize that, you know, going through schooling in the 1910s and 20s could not have been an easy process for my family. And I know that my grandparents were like punished for speaking Spanish. My mom knows pretty minimal Spanish and never taught me Spanish. And it's the same for all of my cousins who are also my generation. We don't know Spanish well enough to have like a really engaging conversation with folks. And that makes us feel a little bit lesser than, and you know, it's like, so that's a thing. That's what comes up for me. So if you all want to share in the chat how some of these conversations make you feel, or how you might have your students think through some of these issues around identity, this is a really good time to do that. Okay, and I do see some of this in the chat. Thank you, Maria. Yeah. There's some other questions. I mean, that is, yeah, those are some of the like experiences, right, where you could still do corporal punishment back in like the 1910s, and a lot of like my family went to segregated schools, right? Even in La Puente, there was a segregated school that my family went to. Corporal punishment was allowed.
Thank you, Rudy. Yeah, I think there are a lot of other parts of this conversation, right? In terms of colorism within our community, immigration status within our community. There are also really important conversations that we need to bring out in terms of opening up that lens, right? Generational differences. All those things are part of this, right? I was very lucky that I could go back to Mexico and have that connection with my family. And yet many of my own family has not been back for 25, 30 years, right? And what does that mean around connections to ancestors and family? And what does that do living on two borders, right? On two different sides of the border, two different parts of the world, and how we communicate and how we keep those connections going. So I think it's imperative that we have those conversations, that we have conversations about pelo bueno, pelo malo, that we have conversations about, pero está blanquito, you know, who's lighter skin, who's darker skin, and allowing students to share those ideas and those conversations around those things within our community to really begin to foster some of that healing, right? And to open up that empathy for others, right? And so that's really, really, really important. I am going to share one more time.
Thank you for that, Amparo. Thank you for everybody for your comments. And if you have any ideas about how you help or anything that you do in the classroom to help your students think about some of these issues, feel free to share that as well.
And I think I just wanted to highlight, as we're transitioning out of the terms piece, is that like even having that conversation or like making room for that conversation is something that, you know, like it doesn't have to be like this month doesn't have to be about teaching about the people per se, even though like that can be a part of it. But I think holding space for this really complex conversation, and like actually having a conversation, because I do feel in our social ether, there's just a lot of like what is right or what is wrong in terms of terminology, but there's not a breaking down where do these terms come from, breaking down like gender neutral language, what does that mean? And so I think that like even having this discussion is worthy of time, especially during this month.
I agree. So we're going to talk about now what usually gets emphasized. And I'm going to say this with mucho cariño, but we also got to be upfront and honest, right? And so what gets taught? Countries, right? The geography, the animals, especially in elementary school, right? A lot of facts. And we have a lot of kids from kinder all the way to 5th and 6th grade doing this for Latinx Heritage Month. The other thing that gets taught, and rightfully so, okay, my computer doesn't want to participate. There we go. Are Latin American artists, right? Diego, Frida, and Pablo Picasso, if students are lucky enough to hear about these great painters, right? And then kids end up with this cultural notion in elementary school, the coloring books, right? Wonderful things. And we tend to end with this whole celebration around Dia de los Muertos. And I love you dearly. If you get me into a conversation about how Halloween and Dia de los Muertos are the same, you're not going to be happy with my explanation, right? Because they're not. They come from a very different place. And so it's important that as we teach these and as we explore these, we get into the complexities and the nuances, right? And that elementary school kids don't end up with this notion that Latin America is this old place where maracas and zarapes exist, right? And maybe some salsa dancing, but everyone has tacos, which is inaccurate historically. And now we think about how do we then bring it to the United States? And again, as much as I love Cesar, and I have met Cesar twice in my life before he passed away, and I've met Sonia Sotomayor, we teach these three, right? It's sort of like within the African-American community, it's Martin, Rosa, and maybe now John Lewis, right? Or Barack. And so we need to think about what does that do when I visit 1st grade classrooms all the way to 7th and 8th grade classrooms where they're being taught Cesar, Dolores, and Sotomayor. If they get some music stuff in there, they're taught Celia, Tito, maybe some mariachi music, right? And when we talk about civil rights within the Latino community, we tend to teach the walkouts, suit riots, and the Delano Great Boycott, right? And this is also what happens on the East Coast. A lot of the kids on the East Coast are learning about Cesar, and which again is perfectly fine. But again, they're learning it 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. And so what would it mean if we think about how we might highlight and shift our thinking around looking at the longstanding contributions of the Latinx communities in the US? And how do we think about uplifting those local stories and local contributions? And so, for example, if we think about teaching about Costa Rica and the fact that Costa Rica is one of the nations right now that is leading the way in environmental issues, and we look at naturbanas, which are these landscapes that are being created around roads to infuse more trees. If we look at the biographies of young people like Sofia Hernandez Salazar, if we look at Central American activists in Los Angeles, such as Wendy Carrillo and Ana Maria Lopez, who was a suffragist who helped pass California's voting rights in 1911 for women. She's also believed to be the first Latina teacher at UCLA. She was a teacher by trade. She grew up in San Gabriel. And then Edward Roybal, who was one of the first Mexican-American congressmen who did a lot for the community. But also Roybal worked very closely with the African-American community, right? And he was seen as an advocate for them. And so what does that bring up for us, right? In terms of many of our communities have joined and have been working with one another. And then the artists are Carlos Almaraz, who is one of the Chicano muralists of the 1970s. And then community art, Cindy talked about that. How do we look at local contributions? How do we look at the paleteros? How do we look at the people who have food trucks? How do we look at the Great Wall of LA that has the history, right, of LA that was painted by people along with Judy Bacai and how long it took them to do. And then how do we look at community art, such as lowriders, right? And how do we incorporate that into what we teach? Not only as forms of joy and resiliency, but also as forms of resistance, right? And that's really important that we think about that. And so I started to write, you can see, I started to think about, there's all this other history that we can think about, right? What is happening in terms of, I thought about, what do we look at? Some cultural things, music. And then I ended in the last column with thinking about what are community issues that lots of Latinx communities are going through, right? The DACA and Dreamers, the Central American detention and what's happening with children, what are happening with the rights of street vendors and them being brutalized and vandalized and some of them hurt severely. How do we think about what's happening with Latinx essential workers? And what is going on with the LGBTQ communities in who, for those young people who identify as Latinx, right? How do we support them? What are our teens doing around environmental issues? And how are many of our communities fighting against regentrification, right? From Washington Heights to Boyle Heights. Lots of people are invested in that conversation. And then for us to think about those times where our communities have not stood alone, but have joined with others, and really thinking about how we bring those out in what we teach during this month, right? That the Delano Grape Boycott was started by Filipino workers, right? That the Cannery Women's boycott and labor strike in Los Angeles was a joint effort between Japanese American women and Mexican, Spanish, and I believe Italian women, right? That after the World Wars, there were many GIs that came back and fought for civil rights. And that huge amount of protests happened around Vietnam, right? And then what we think about most about is education. Where are those times where our communities have come together to think about education and how we care for one another, right? And so this was just one of my many lists that I've been thinking about. And so we don't have a lot of time, but we do want to give you guys some time to think about. We've shared a lot of thinking. What might it look like and sound like if we started to highlight more of the longstanding contributions of the Latinx communities in the US? And how do we reflect the resiliency and local stories? And we want to just open it up for some conversation.
I'll read this comment since I know that we're having, Maria's having some mic issues. Highlighting these stories is a great way to build empathy, compassion across cultures and races. Thank you for that, Maria.
Hey, you guys, this is Danny Fuentes coming in. I think that one of the good things that we're doing, and also kind of reiterating what was just said by Maria, is that I think one of the things we need to do is really start highlighting our local stories. and talking about our families and what they've done to contribute to this fabric of the United States. And I know earlier on during the summer, we had some workshops, I think UCLA Center X also put on in regards to documenting these through like radio and through recordings, and like a program called StoryCorps. I know UCI had a program on that this summer. And, you know, it's for us to start documenting these things and incorporating our stories into the fabric. I think that us taking the initiative to start doing that, to let our kids know that our stories are real and what our family goes through is real, and it's part of history that we should be studying.
I want to add to that Latino Americans has a whole section called "What Does It Mean to Be a Latino for Me?" that students can submit. And then also the California Historical Society has an ongoing piece on Call Mis Historias, where also students can record themselves and submit videos. So I think that there's a bigger effort, like Daniel said, to record and to share those stories, right? Not only within ourselves, but with others. And one of the things that I'm working on with 2 elementary school teachers who are going to join us next week is that they are having their students interview family members who are immigrants. And we're going to talk about how that project's been going and what the students have been learning from that as well.
You know, I just thinking about what you were saying, Danny, I think that's a really good starting point for us educators. Is like, let's explore the stories within the communities that we teach. Let's get to learn about our communities. Let's get to learn about our students and their families and their experiences, and let's draw from that, right? And let's uplift that. Chavez is important, right? Huerta is important. These are really important things, but they're also part of that's like a larger narrative. And you'll find that these stories that are coming out of your community are connected to those narratives in some way, shape, or form. And so, like, how powerful is that for us to uplift, to use the language on the slide, local stories and help students see how it's part of this bigger narrative, right, that we traditionally teach. So something that, you know, I talk to my team, I've talked to my team about in the past, is sort of like this story of the emergence of like Chicano style rock and roll in East LA and the San Gabriel Valley in the 1950s. Like, that's a really unique story that's local, that my students can connect with, but there's historians who argue that those are forms of resistance, right? The dance halls and the music and the sort of identification and sort of creation of culture were acts of resistance in a time when segregation was rampant. And racism targeted at those communities was a real thing. So we're talking about a lot of resources. We have put together a pretty big list of resources, and we're collecting them here on this Padlet. So go ahead and click on that Padlet and you'll see what I'm talking. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Amparo. And Amparo, you are responsible for about 99% of these things. So you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about this?
So in my, as I shared with you, right, I've been trying to collect pieces to support teachers with teaching. And so please, if you have pieces, if you have materials, send them my way. We are trying to collect as many book lists that we can from as many different places. We're looking at activism and Afro-Latinos. We're trying to look at Puerto Rican artists, and there's this great resource from New York City, which is called New York City Teach, that looks at influential, it looks at the history of Latinx from the East Coast perspective, right? And so, you know, there's a lot of local history, there's a lot of pieces. We're gonna keep on adding to this. So, you know, revisit it. There's a lot of materials now. We are very lucky that lots of people are uncovering things, and they continue to uncover things. So if you have more resources, more links, share them with us, and feel free to, you know, share with other folks where we're collecting resources as well. So we're going to give you a couple minutes to maybe start checking these out. And if you find one that really speaks to you, that stands out, and you want to give it a shout out, please do so. Daniel, can you put the link to the We Teach New York City one in the chat too? I don't think we put it on the yet.
Yeah.
That was my fault. Sorry, guys. I forgot to give that one to Daniel yesterday. I'm assuming people are looking through these, but I can't see you. So I apologize if I keep it going. Are you guys there?
Hi, Amparo. I was just going to ask.
I
Could you potentially email these out to us after the session?
Yeah, we're also compiling them in a Google Doc so that folks can also use it and add to it as well. Thank you,
Sure.
Ron.
Yeah, I was
And
going to give a
Cal.
shout out also to Teaching Central America. They
Mhm.
sent a website, an email out today with some clickable links. A lot of really good resources.
Yes. And Callie, you were going to say something. Please share.
Oh no, I was just saying that I'm looking through the resources right now.
These resources are so incredible. I'm so happy right now just flipping through everything. So I want to thank you guys for this. This is incredible, and thank you for the wonderful ideas.
Thank you. We're gonna go ahead.
Oh no, I just want to say we definitely have some love in the chat too. Maria is posting in there saying that the resources are amazing.
Well, the great thing about these resources, everyone, is that this is a combination of like some terrific stuff that we found. Well, I don't want to say we, Amparo found found online and just doing tons of research the past few days. And it's also a representation of some of the lesson plans that we have developed. The lesson curriculum, you'll notice that the first 5 or 6 lessons were written by ourselves and our teacher leaders. And then there's some primary source sets, the one right there on your screen that says Teaching California. That one was, Cindy went into the archives and she pulled out some amazing photos of activism in the 1980s. And so you have these things that we've created, including a slide deck in the local history resources from a historian who gave a talk for us, and just mixed in with these other terrific resources. And we plan on adding to these.
I want to add this comment in the chat. One last reflection to complicate and challenge this narrative of the Latinx community outside of like the common figures like Cesar Chavez is to acknowledge that we Latinx are diverse, complex, and worthy of dedicating extended time in the curriculum. So yes, like making time during this month is an act of resistance for sure. For sure.
And I think thinking also about, I'm talking to my elementary school gente here, right? Like think about where in your social studies, in your LA curriculum, you can include more of these stories, more of these topics, right? I often find that elementary school teachers, because they teach so many different things and content is not something that they have a lot of time to research. They do the social studies by month, right? So this month is Latinx, next month is Indigenous people, and then, you know, we get to Asian American month, Women's month. And so really think about, how do I infuse these stories? How do I talk to my colleagues so that we're not all teaching Cesar Chavez? And like I said, we're going to share with you guys, one third grade teacher is going to focus more on chefs and cooks within the Latinx community, and the fourth grade teacher is going to look at music within the Latinx community. So what does that look like, and what does that mean, right, for our young people to see those topics as well?
And just to add to that as well, looking at Kelly's comment in the chat, this idea that something she's really hoping to think through this month are some like good essential questions and a clear purpose for what lessons, reflections, projects she introduces to her students. So like this idea of like the intentionality of like what to teach during that month. And that resonates with me, because something that I thought about, right? Like it can be like, obviously this month can be whatever you make it, but as I was thinking through that of like, if I were in the classroom, what would be some of the things that I would want to highlight this month? Something that I keep coming back to is how devastating COVID was for the Latino community, and how this can be a space to hold, like as we're looking at community history, this can be a space of holding space for our students who were impacted. Like the Latino community was so adversely affected. I don't know anybody who hasn't had somebody. And I think that one thing that's happening right now is we're back, I feel like we're back to the productivity stage of just being in the classroom, because we're back with our students, right? And so not saying that you all, but like society is just like, okay, let's go, we're going. And like the reminder that we're still in a pandemic, that this is still affecting communities, and that hasn't been processed. There hasn't been time to process that. And so what does that mean to process that for the Latino community during this month is something that I'm sitting with, and something that I'm definitely exploring.
We are getting close to closing, and we want to invite you to please say goodbye. You know, in the Latino community, you spend quite a bit of time saying goodbye, despidiéndote. And so I want to give a shout out to all of you who came. Please let other folks know about our continuing series. We will have next week a session focusing on elementary school teachers, and we'll have 3 presenters that day. On September 30th, a very good teacher friend of mine and I will be talking about how do we center Indigenous sustainable farming ideas and the impact of colonization on Mesoamerican farming. We're going to try to shift people's thinking for that. And then our last session, we're really excited because we're going to have a guest speaker from Guatemala. Cindy, can you remind us and then tell us what else we're going to do?
Yes, so the last week we'll be setting us up. Thank you, Ron, for the pitch. Setting us up for Teaching Central American History Week. So that happens on the last week of Latinx Heritage Month. So we'll be talking about being intentional with our resources as we think about teaching Central America. And again, not just leaving it in the past. So we're going to be having a guest speaker who's a young Mayan Indigenous activist who will be here to talk to us about what are the current day issues that they are working towards in terms of liberation in Guatemala.